How he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Luke chapter 24, verse 30, what we just now read. When they were at table, he took the bread and said the blessing, broke it and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. I repeat, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, recognized Jesus. When did they recognize? When he took the bread, broke it and gave it to them, they were able to recognize. Which means to say that all this time walking on the way to Emmaus, they did not recognize. Even when they invited Jesus to stay with them, they did not recognize. When he explained to them about the scriptures, all about the prophets' prophecies, they did not recognize him. But when he broke the bread, they recognized. Jesus not recognizing, disciples not recognizing Jesus, this is not the first time. Many times in the Bible also we read the disciples failed to recognize Jesus and his power. Jesus walking on the water. Peter and the disciples were in the boat. Jesus comes to them walking on the water. And what happens? They think that it is a ghost. They don't recognize Jesus. They think Jesus for a ghost. And they get frightened. Then Jesus says, take courage, it is I. So many times the disciples failed to recognize Jesus and his power in their own life. In the Old Testament, we see how people recognized God. They recognized God in the wind, in the pillar of fire, in the column of cloud, and in the meeting tents. These were the places where people recognized God and God's presence. Whereas in today's gospel, in the breaking of the bread, they recognized Jesus. Which means to say that Eucharist is, that's why the Vatican II says that Eucharist is a source and summit of Christian life, which means every time we break bread at the altar, we are to recognize Jesus. It is only in the Eucharist that we recognize Jesus more closely. And what is Eucharist for us? How do we look at the Eucharist? For some of them, it is only an obligation. One of the precepts or the rules of the church says, on Sundays and on days of obligation, you must attend the Holy Eucharist. Therefore, all church-goers, for many of them, the Mass becomes only an obligation to fulfill. If I attend a Sunday Mass, I am happy because it is an obligation. If I don't attend the Sunday Mass, I feel sad, I feel disturbed. It is just because obligation. Is Eucharist just an obligation for us? And how much respect do I give to the Eucharist? For some of them, Eucharist is just a fashion parade. I want to dress up nicely because there are so many people coming to the church. They will see me, they will see my beauty, they will see my dress. So I do a nice dress, wear a nice dress, I put on nice makeup and I come to the church. For some of them, wearing nice dress is Eucharist. How many of us sitting in the church when we have attended the Mass, in the church we have used the mobile phones and not attending the Holy Eucharist? There are times while the Mass is going on, when I go around the church, I have confiscated few mobile phones during the Mass, using mobile phones. Do I respect the Eucharist in which I recognize Jesus? Today the whole world is thirsting for Jesus. How about us? We are thirsting to come to the church to attend Mass. As soon as this 144 section is removed, this ban is removed, we will all be very happy to come. So at this moment we are all thirsting. A deer that thirsts for water, as soon as it finds the water, it is so happy. So as long as it is thirsty, it runs around to find. Likewise, our heart, our soul, our being is so thirsty to attend the Eucharist these days, because we are not able to attend the Mass, because we are at home. We are not able to come to the church to attend. We have a thirst to attend the Mass. Such should be the thirst at every Eucharist that we attend. Just because the Eucharist is celebrated every Sunday and every day, it doesn't mean that we take the Eucharist for granted. So when we have taken the Eucharist for granted, maybe it is a time for you, for me who celebrate the Eucharist. How many times have I taken the Eucharist for granted and have celebrated the Eucharist without meaning? And how many times as faithful we have attended the Eucharist without proper attention, without our mind, soul and heart in the Eucharist? Maybe this time where we are not able to attend the Eucharist is a time we need to realize the importance of the Eucharist. How much we are missing the Holy Mass. We are not able to come. That's why Pope Francis in his circular, he tells that this is not the real church, because there are no people in the church. There are no sacraments taking place. This is not the real church. He says the real church is when people are in the church, when the sacraments are taking place in the church. That is the real church. This is not the real church. Therefore he wants that there are some of us who may get addicted, or we may like this online Mass. So we are so happy. There are some of them who said that in online Mass you can even fast forward for the Simon's homily. So you don't like the homily, you will fast forward and straight away go to the offertory hymn. Some of us may get addicted. That's why Pope Francis is telling there is a danger that people might get addicted to online Mass. And he says that this is not the real church. Real church is when you and me are gathered in the church around the Eucharistic altar, and when the sacraments are being administered in the church. That is the real church. Today, because of the circumstances, we are attending online Holy Mass. Therefore, Eucharist is important. As we thirst today for the Holy Mass, such should be our thirst every time when we come for the Holy Eucharist, because we recognize Jesus in the Eucharist as the disciples did. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 27. If anyone eats of the bread or drinks from the cup of the Lord unworthily, he sins against the body and blood of the Lord. Unworthily. Anyone who participates in the Eucharist unworthily. There have been times we have unworthily participated, which means we sin against the Eucharist, we sin against the Lord itself. Therefore, remember the Eucharist is very important for us. And in one way, we recognize Jesus in the Eucharist, and that Eucharist calls us to live the Eucharist in our life. The Eucharist symbolizes so many things. So many things like the Eucharist is a symbol of unity. The Eucharist is a symbol of forgiveness. The Eucharist is a symbol of sharing, where Jesus breaks himself and gives. That's why we need to recognize Jesus in the Eucharist, and when we recognize him, these qualities of the Eucharist, qualities of forgiveness, love, sacrifice, sharing, all these things will come into our life. Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, as the disciples on the way to Emmaus recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread, we also recognize Jesus in the Eucharist. That's why the early Christian community, they came together very often for prayer and for breaking of the bread. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, we will come to know how the disciples came together, because they knew that they were able to recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Therefore, let Eucharist be the source of life for all of us. Let us give the utmost reverence for the Eucharist. As we come back to the church after all these problems are over, remember to give reverence, utmost reverence for the Eucharist, participate wholeheartedly in the Eucharist, and recognize Jesus and receive his blessings. Amen.